Okay, I think we're live. And yes, in the last video, I ended with verse 159 of Surah 7, where Muhammad says, "Surely they divided their religion into parts and became sects. You have no concern with them; their affairs only with Allah. Then He will inform them of what they did." And the irony here, excuse me, is that this was written when Islam presumably was one united um, front. The party of There was no party of Ali, i.e., Shiites. There were no Sunni Orthodox Muslims. There were no uh, Khawarijites. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but they didn't exist. And there were no Ahmadi Muslims. So there was one unified Muslim front, and presumably Muhammad thought this would exist in perpetuity because he condemns other religions for breaking off into sects. And by this point, even though the Great Schism hadn't happened, there were various sects within Christianity and, of course, Judaism. You had, especially after the temple was destroyed, the second temple. But it's ironic that this is in the eternal word of Allah, whom Muslims believe is God, a condemnation of other religions and pointing to them dividing into sects as somehow a validation of Islam, when immediately upon Muhammad's death, the moment he died, Islam split into sects. The Ridda Wars, the fight after the four rightly guided caliphs, after that era ceased, between Sunnis and what would become Sunnis and Shia Muslims, and on, to the point where you had self-proclaimed Mahdis, particularly the most famous being the Mahdi of Sudan, Muslims who would repeatedly assume the title of Mahdi, who Muslims believe who has a large role in Armageddon and end times in Muslim eschatology. So ever since Muhammad died, you've had a succession of different sects and divisions and people contesting Islam. So it's ironic that this is included in the Quran. But today, I'd just like to talk about Surah 7, the elevated places, and the really amazing part of this is this is a very long surah. It's about, I would say, 16 pages long. And the key point here is this surah is an illustration of how Muhammad did not grasp the concept of a parable, i.e., a story that was used in order to elucidate a much broader point. And Jesus is famous for parables. He used parables as a way, particularly after the people of Israel the majority of them started to resist his message and resist the notion that he was their Messiah, because he didn't fit their perceptions of what a Messiah should be. He would particularly after that, he would use parables in order to confuse and essentially allow these people to pursue their own desires and not grow closer to him, because he realized that their heart, they had hard hearts and didn't want to listen to or understand his message. Just like in Isaiah, when God tells Isaiah that he's sending him there to he's sending him to and people should keep in mind this was right before Israel would be led into captivity. Judah. It started with the northern kingdom, Israel, and subsequent to that, for another 2 centuries or so, Judah was allowed to remain, and God gave them time to repent. But eventually, they would be led into captivity as well. And God told Isaiah that He wanted to dull these people who had resisted every entreaty from God. He wanted to dull them, and eventually they became so complacent that they couldn't repent, and they were eventually destroyed and led into captivity. The people from Israel never returned, and Judah was eventually 40 to 50,000 were able to return out of several million that were living in Persia. But to get back to the point, these parables were used to elucidate a larger point, and in large part they were used to to um, to dull people who had hard hearts and were resistant to the message of Jesus. And he would explain his disciples, even his disciples would be the apostles would be confused by these parables, some of them, and Jesus would take them aside and explain them to them because they were his followers, his true followers. But for the majority of people, he would not explain these parables. And this surah is a good illustration of how Muhammad did not grasp the concept of parables. Now, I just like to start by going to verse. Let me see. Excuse me. To verse 13 to verse 12, where he describes the devil, or the serpent's resistance, i.e., the adversary, the devil, his resistance to make obeisance to Adam. Now, at this point, what was popularly sometimes is called Lucifer, but generally the Satan in the Bible. He was one of the angels that tried to elevate himself above God, above the Creator, and rebelled and led a third of the host of heaven to resist him. And this is described in the book of Isaiah. But here is the Muslim interpretation of the creation of Adam and the refusal of Iblis, i.e., the Satan, to make obeisance to him. He said, "What hindered you so that you did not make obeisance when I commanded you?" He said, "I am better than he. Thou hast created me of fire, while him thou didst create of dust." Now, this is an interesting point because Muhammad, i.e., Allah, seems to be very confused about what man was created from. At different points in the Quran, he says he was created of dust. He was created of a seed, which is referring to sperm. which Muslims believe is produced between the vertebrae, because that's what Muhammad said in the Quran, and it's also said that he was produced from clay. So it even though this is supposedly created eternally by Allah, he seems to be very confused about what elements were used to create man. But something else is that Muslims do not believe in original sin. The way they describe the fall is very odd when you contrast it with the account in Genesis, especially when you consider the fact that Muslims pretend that they honor the Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament, the Torah, and the Torah is repeatedly invoked throughout the Quran, and yet they have a completely different account of what happened there. They don't believe that there's original sin. They don't believe that original sin exists, which is why you have a religion that's very works based. Their soteriology is incredibly works based, and even towards the very end of the Quran describes how you have to strive, you have to continually strive, and perhaps you'll earn Allah's favor. So the things that are wrong with Islam, it begins with definitely with the cross, the fact that they don't recognize their antichrist, but also it goes back to Genesis, the fundamental idea of the fall and the garden is completely misinterpreted by Muhammad, and this is why you have this very warped, works-based type of salvation, and you have this rampant confusion over how men are saved, over salvation in general. And in 13, he said, "Then get forth from this state, for it does not befit you to behave proudly therein. Go forth, therefore, surely you are of the abject ones." He said, respite me until the day when they are raised up. He said, surely you are of the respited ones. He said, as thou hast caused me to remain disappointed, I would certainly lie and wait for them in thy straight path. Now, just to emphasize this point, there's no description of the eventual reconciliation of mankind through Jesus Christ. The idea of women bearing going through childbirth, and a woman eventually bearing a child that will crush the serpent's head, i.e., crush the adversary, the Satan's head, and defeat his plan. There's no description of that because, again, this would necessitate a reevaluation of Jesus Christ and his centrality to not only the gospel but to the Bible, the entire story of the Bible from Genesis through to Revelation. So there's no description of that. The prophecy that was ultimately fulfilled after Jesus' resurrection, and there's none of that. Just a brief conversation with the Satan and his vow that he'll get back at them by tormenting man. And it describes also the shaitan, i.e. the Satan, suggesting that the apple be eaten. Your Lord has not forbidden you this tree, except that you may not both become two angels, or that you may not become of the immortals. And he swore to them both, most surely I am a sincere advisor to you. Then he caused them to fall by deceit. So when they tasted of the tree, their evil inclinations became manifest to them, and they both began to cover themselves with the leaves of the garden. And the Lord called out to them, did I not forbid you both from that tree, and say to you that the shaitan is your open enemy? And it goes on to to explain how Allah had a conversation with Adam and Eve, and basically giving out a list of rules. Um, and then it segues from this into a description. Let me see. It just goes on and on, just setting out rules and regulations. Presumably, this is part of some things that were gleaned from the Torah that were included in this description of Adam and Eve leaving the garden. And let's just go to 39. And the foremost of them will say to the last of them, so you have no preference over us, therefore taste the chastisement for what you earn. Surely as for those who reject our communications and turn away from them, the doors of heaven shall not be open for them, nor shall that they enter the garden to the camel pass through the eye of the needle, and thus do we reward the guilty. Now again, this is something that the Quran plagiarized from the Bible, a teaching of Jesus, and it was the application in the Bible was that a rich a a rich young ruler wanted to know how he would go about how he would go about obtaining salvation, and he said, I've followed all of the commandments since I was a little boy. And Jesus told him, you do well. Now all you have to do, and then he told him he had to give up all of his wealth. And it says and then it describes how the rich young ruler was grieved because he was very wealthy. So, in other words, he was not willing to sacrifice his personal idol, i.e., the attachment to his wealth. Now, some people will misuse this story and try to claim that it's an indictment of wealth or riches, and it's actually the point of the story is that venality and covetousness is a very deep-seated sin, and that it's almost it is impossible to seek after heaven and communion with God when your priority is riches. But it's not the riches, it's the covetousness, the idea that you're not willing to sacrifice. And following Christ does involve great sacrifice. But again, none of this is explained in the Quran. It's just one of those things that Muhammad plagiarized from the Bible, kind of bowdlerized it, and then inserted it with his own spin, in completely devoid of context. So there's no application here. It's just plopped down there with no with no with with nothing to guide the people reading this. And if we go down to 50, we will see, and the inmates of the fire shall call out to the dwellers of the garden, pour on us some water of that which Allah has given you. They shall say, surely Allah has prohibited them both to unbelievers. Now, this is where the parable of Lazarus and the rich man begins in this surah. And again, it's something that was plagiarized from the gospel, but it's not explained. The origin is not explained. The application is not there. And the people who are reading this have no idea what to do with this story. And this is why you have so many Muslims that have no sense of God, what God desires, what sort of relationship he wants. They don't even believe that he wants a personal relationship with his creation. And this is one of the main reasons why, because you have Muslims who are following a book that is basically a compilation of different teachings from the Bible, which were misinterpreted. Some of them were completely inverted and just cobbled together and synthesized into this incoherent mess. There's no narrative. It's not like the Bible where you have a narrative of creation and God's communion with man and man's rebellion in the fall and the decision to choose a nation, Israel, and Israel's Israel going into captivity and being led out of captivity and being given the law and the construction of the temple, the punishment of Israel and destruction of the temple, and the 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 birth of Christ, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, and ultimately the second coming of Christ. This is a coherent, cogent narrative. The Quran, on the other hand, like I said, is just a combination of Arabic folk tales, monotheistic religions that are not monotheistic religions like Zoroastrianism, as well as Judaism, parts of the Torah, parts of the Gospel, most of them misinterpreted, some of them misunderstood, some of them deliberately altered. All of these things, Arabic poetry, all of these things just lumped together, given no context at all. So here in verse 50, you have the part of the story of Lazarus and the rich man, where Lazarus, as I already described it, for those who aren't familiar with it, Lazarus was a rich man who, I'm sorry, Lazarus was a beggar who had boils and sores all over his body and was in great distress and pain and mired in poverty, who just wanted some scraps from the table of Lazarus, and his dogs would lick his wounds. And it's described after Lazarus died, he goes into Abraham's bosom. And after the rich man dies, he goes into Hades, the temporary dwelling place before for people who are ultimately going to be in the lake of fire in hell permanently. And he calls out to Abraham to give him some water, or to have Lazarus dip use some, allow him to dip his tongue in water. And Abraham explains how there's a great chasm between Lazarus, who is in paradise, and he who's in torment. And this is what's being described here. And pour on us some water of that which Allah has given you, these shall say, surely Allah has prohibited them both to the unbelievers. But none of that is explained. The fact that this was taken from the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, one of the most famous parables, even for people who haven't read the Bible, it's part of our popular culture. There's even a folk song that's been around for centuries, Lazarus and Divers. It's been repurposed dozens of times. And so, I mean, most people are probably at least vaguely aware of this, but Muslims, on the other hand, are aware of this through a very foreshortened, just devoid of context passage in their holy book, which makes no sense whatsoever because it's been taken out of context, it's been plagiarized, and then just dropped in the middle of a much longer surah. And I mean, there's not much more to say on this particular passage, other than it's this same mistake is repeated later on in the same surah, where Moses's confrontation with Pharaoh is described, and also God demonstrating his power and his ability to use Moses. That's also being described. So in 107, it says he threw his rod, and lo, it was a clear serpent, and he drew forth his hand, and lo, it was white to the beholders. Now this was something that God did. He gave Moses leprosy, and then he pulled his hand back, and the leprosy disappeared. This was just a demonstration of God's power and the fact that he would be able to use Moses to affect his ultimate plan to lead Israel out of captivity and to make and to give them and to fulfill the promise made to Abraham centuries before. But again, none of this is explained. The context is stripped out. It's taking an entire book, Exodus, and focusing on a couple of minor parts, and even those parts are just completely mangled. So I mean, this is pretty much what you expect from the Quran after a while, because it's repeated ad nauseum. The same mistakes are repeated ad nauseum throughout the text. Now, I just want to re-emphasize the point that this entire surah, the elevated places, is an illustration of how Muslims do not understand the concept of a parable, which is a story that using a story to analogize something in real life to make a point. For example, the story, the parable, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus was told in order to convey the idea that you should not put your trust in riches or wealth, but not just that, but that you shouldn't put your trust in temporal things that are going to evaporate. You should put your trust in heavenly things, in You should put your trust and your faith in God, not in things that you cannot retain once you leave the earth. But here in 176, he says, "And if we had pleased, we would certainly have exalted him thereby, but he clung to the earth and his low desire. So his parable is as the parable of the dog. If you attack him, he lolls out his tongue, and if you leave him alone, he lolls out his tongue. This is the parable of the people who reject our communications, therefore relate the narrative that they may reflect." And this is said in the to emphasize the fact that Allah doesn't want anyone to be associated with him. This is basically an anti-Trinitarian talking point, which crop up throughout the Quran. Going back to 173, or you would say only our fathers associated others with Allah before, and we were an offspring after them. Wilt thou then destroy us for what the vain doers did? And it's just emphasizing how limited the knowledge of Muhammad was about everything, not just science or history. The fact that Dhul Qarnayn, i.e., Alexander the Great, is described as a devout Muslim when Alexander was a Greek pagan, Alexander of Macedon. He did not worship Allah or any Muslim deity. But again, Muhammad did not know that. He did not know. He did not understand parables. He did not understand. And this is another one in 179. And certainly we have created for hell many of the jinn and the men. They have hearts which they do not understand, and they have eyes which they do not see, and they have ears with which they do not hear. They are as cattle, nay, they are in worse errors. These are the heedless ones. And again, this is completely not scriptural. Hell was created for the fallen angels, the what you would call demons, the ones that rebelled against God. It wasn't created for men. This wasn't planned as an abode for human beings. But again, it just illustrates how unscriptural the Quran is from beginning to end. And I just want to wrap up. This is the conclusion of Surah 7. I just want to wrap up with 203. And when you bring them not a revelation, they say, why do you not forge it? Say, I only follow what is revealed to me from my Lord. These are clear proofs from your Lord, and a guidance and a mercy for people who believe. And when the Quran is recited, then listen to it and remain silent. That mercy may be shown to you. And again, this is this passage again is an example of the contradictions and the hypocrisy of the Quran. First of all, Muhammad did forge several passages of the Quran. Secondly, there's no evidence that anything in the Quran was revealed to him by the Lord. As there's a great book by Ibn Rawak, Why I Am Not a Muslim, which you can take a look at here. And this is a former someone who grew up in a Muslim family in the Middle East. Ibn Rawak is a pseudonym, but he's published books critiquing Islam from the point of view of atheism. But he does make a lot of great points about the limitations of the Quran, specifically by citing Orientalist writers, people who not only spoke in studied Arabic, but had a comprehensive knowledge of Arabic and actually translated the Quran and the Hadiths and the tafsirs, the tafsir. Like, people who these Orientalists who come in for lots of scorn from Muslims because they point up the failings of the Quran. The only reason we have English language or translations in Western languages of these Arabic books is because of these people. That's how knowledgeable they were and the years of dedication. But he cites them repeatedly, and a lot of them a lot of them made this point that almost there's nothing new in the Quran by itself. It's taken from parts of the Torah, parts of the Gospel. It's taken their Zoroastrianism, parts Sabian, pagan mythology. Almost everything is taken from somewhere else, and there's no proof that God revealed any of this to Muhammad. The revelations were either things that Muhammad invented in order to justify his authority, or you could say that they were given to him by a demon if the encounter he had with Jibril was recounted accurately, and he did try to commit suicide multiple times by throwing himself off of a cliff. So, but there's no evidence to indicate that any of these were revelations by God. But the fact, like I said, there is forgery, there's abrogation, i.e., Quran verses that were abrogated, then that were nullified, which to me is a good sign that this is not the work of God. But also in 205, 204, and when the Quran is recited, then listen to it and remain silent, that mercy may be shown to you. This is just something that illustrates the cloistered, just hermetically sealed nature of Islam. You can't question the Quran. You can't conduct a critical analysis. There are Christians that wrote critical analyses of the Bible, of different that challenge certain parts, but you can't even question the Quran, which is a good sign that it's not of God, when you can't even raise a question about certain verses without the threat of being executed or imprisoned. But again, this video was just looking at some of the ways that the Quran stole from the Bible and made things much worse and left Muslims confused. And I'm just trying to alleviate some of that confusion.